Welcome everybody to the new Lyre podcast. My name is David Gosselin and I'm here with Adam Sedia.
Good to be with you again.
Welcome, Adam. And we have a great, fun show for everybody. This is going to be for World Poetry Day, which is tomorrow, March 21st. It's a very exciting time. The world needs poetry. The world is in all sorts of
Turmoil.
all sorts of turmoil, all sorts of chaos and confusion. And I think poetry is really a place where we can ground ourselves. It's an area where we can all look to for wisdom and joy and insight. And the insight is really unlimited if we really get into the topic. So we're just going to have a free-flowing discussion here, talk about the role of poetry in society, the need for poetry in society, and what we can hope for in the coming years, and what's been going on already. Different discussions about poetry, different ideas about poetry. It's a really fun subject, so I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
I already am. But you raised a really profound point there. With all the chaos and the turmoil and the confusion, poetry offers one of the few anchors to which something unmovable to which you can attach and have some grounding while the world swirls chaotically around you. And the reason is that poetry is about the expression of ideas, and ideas never change. Some go in fashion, some go out of fashion, but the ideas are still there. And, much like religious belief or spiritual values, it's something eternal and unchanging. And poetry that takes on that mission is, I think, what we can call successful poetry.
Right. They say that literature is the soul of a society, right? That literature is really, poetry is the lifeblood of culture. Every culture.
Was that Goethe?
Goethe famously said that the decline of literature signals the decline of a nation.
Oh, well, that's the same thing put in conversely.
Yeah, and I think it's a very useful idea, and it seems maybe a bit it doesn't seem that obvious maybe when we think of all the things going on in the world, that poetry would really be something to look to or to consider. But I mean, when we think about the greatest poets that have lived and the worlds that they embodied, from Homer's Iliads to Dante's comedy to Shakespeare's dramas to Aeschylus's tragedies, there's really something there which speaks to something higher in human beings, something that reminds us of what we truly are, which might be sometimes not that easy to remember or to keep in mind as we go through the day-to-day, the daily grind. But all the more, that's why I think we need reminders of what humanity is really capable of doing, and what quality of mind is needed to really what quality of mind is needed when we're in a crisis, right? What does it mean to think poetically, right? What does it mean to have poetic insight?
Well, here I go with my Greek again. Crisis comes from the word for judgment. You're at a crossroads and you need to decide which path to take. Where do you guide? What determines which path to go down? That's what poetry does, is it's that guide. It's that compass that points you in the direction you should go.
Absolutely. And it is a guide. And it also, this March 21st is just a few days away from Robert Frost's birthday, a great American poet who was born on the 26th of March. And I think it's also it's apropos to bring up the person of Robert Frost, who is really an amazing poet and speaks to precisely this question of this grounding, right? This wisdom, this calm voice in the burning theater, right? And gets us to consider the things that we might not seem immediate, but really are the more enduring and crucial aspects of human existence.
Well, and in the burning theater of poetry too, I think Frost has a special place and deserves a special mention because of the type of poet he was in the age he was.
Mhm.
After World War One, it was starting before World War One. You had the birth of modernism, and after World War One, completely swept aside everything familiar and loved, to the world, at least. Modernism became the dominant current, in poetry in particular. And up until his last years, Frost really was untouched by that. And the fact that he was able to build a successful career, uh, while remaining true to him in an age that flat out rejected his aesthetic, I think is remarkable. And I think it offers a lesson for today's poets going forward.
Mm, absolutely. And Robert Frost is one of these poets that he really manages. Robert Frost famously said, "A poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom." And I think that's a perfect encapsulation of the role of poetry, that in a sense it's twofold. It does have to entertain, right? It does have to speak to the average person. At the same time, it also has to speak to that which is higher or highest in every individual, which they might not be conscious of at every moment in their lives. None of us are, but all
Well,
the more that's why poetry is there.
that's a re-expression of a very old idea. Sir Philip Sidney, back in the 17th century, in a famous essay, wrote that the purpose of poetry was twofold: to teach and to delight.
Hmm.
And that's what Frost is saying, but he's putting a new spin on it. It begins in delight and ends in wisdom. In other words, you have the inspiration from a sense object before you, and that turns into, uh, the whole point of the the inspiration is the lesson that is drawn for it. That is why it's worth writing down and sharing with others, is because it contains, uh, a vision of truth, wisdom, that those who did not experience the same sense object can still draw from and appreciate.
Absolutely. And I think there's been a dearth of such poetry in the as at least especially in the later half of the 20th century. And I think we're seeing a change now. I think we're seeing revitalization of timeless poetry, as opposed to poetry that is merely there to speak to the zeitgeist, which is what in many ways modernism did. It doesn't mean there aren't nice things in modernism, but there was this whole idea that, and in a sense there were there were some false assumptions there in terms of modernism had to speak to the realities of the 20th century, of quote unquote modern society, And so all of a sudden, there's all these things that we're supposed to talk about that weren't discussed before in poetry. But there was also this sort of false opposition where, people thought of romanticism and just this sort of romantic idealization of nature and beauty, and that's what poetry was. And so modernism was, in a sense, more mature, right? It was poetry grown up that was now going to take on this new set of issues, which previous poetry wasn't uh, wasn't up to, right? But I think there's all sorts of fallacies involved in that, because when we're talking about poetry, as you said, we're talking about that 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 unchanging, right? There's something which is changing, but there's something which is unchanging, and poetry speaks to both of those things. The art of, I'd say, great timeless poetry is that it brings together that which is changing, that which is always unchanging, right? And regardless of the time that you're in, the question is, how are you going to wed that which is changing, the many, with that which is unchanging, the one, in Plato's terms, right? How do you unite the one and the many? I mean, this is the age-old paradox. And I think if we look at all great art throughout the centuries, right, whether it's in, it's classical Arabic poetry, classical Chinese poetry, Italian poetry, Shakespeare, Keats, Shelley, Poe, right? Poe speaks of the supernal loveliness, the poetic principle, which is a principle that can express itself in myriad forms, right? He says that the poetic sentiment can be found in all sorts of different mediums. He talks about painting, music, especially, and very, very interestingly, in the landscape painting, right? The classical Chinese paintings are a beautiful example of that. The landscapes, the mountains and the mists, the landscape.
Or think of Poe's own age with Thomas Cole. But I do want to backtrack a little bit. Modernism defined itself in by what it was opposed to, by what it was not. Its whole outlook was, we're in a new age with new times. These are unprecedented experiences. We need a poetry that speaks to this time. And the flaw in that thinking, and I think we're slowly realizing this as time goes on and we're more and more numb to the shock that the First World War and its end brought about. Human nature hasn't really changed in the last 150 years. Have human experiences really changed all that much?
Hmm.
No. Have differing schools of thought, or schools of poetry. You have, the metaphysical poets, the neoclassical poets, I'll call them, like Shelley and Keats. But these are just variations. They're stylistic variations.
Hmm.
Their outlook on humanity and life and the purpose and function of poetry is distant. Uh, and it's only when we get to modernism that there's this jarring lurch away from all that, into, what might be called politely introspection, what I'll call navel gazing, solipsism, that really has dominated poetry and has gotten worse as the decades after the first modern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one way to think about it, because people might, think they might hear this and think that we're somehow, dishing against modernism. But if we think of it if we think of the question, we're thinking about art. We're thinking about the role of poetry, of beauty in society. And if we frame what if we framed it in terms of, well, what's the effect? What's the effect of this work of art? What's the effect of this poem? Right? Why does this poem work? Why is this poem beautiful? And there's many ways to answer that. And that's really what we want to explore. But I think that if we think about it, Poe talks about the effect that the poetic principle, right, the poetic sentiment is really, it's not a thing as such. It's the effect that a poem has on you. This is really the purpose. This is the goal. And so if we think of, well, what is the effect of different poems on the human sensibility? I think we can, if we look over time at different kinds of poetry, different eras, there are certain recurring themes. And I think what stands out though with modernism is the nihilism and the cynicism and the pessimism, which it leaves us, that's what it leaves us with so often, uh, too often, I think we could say. And we have to wonder why, right? Why is it that a certain kind of art leaves us feeling empty, or, like everything is meaningless? What underlies that?
Well, that's because of, and this ties everything in that you just said. When Poe talks about effect, he's talking about twofold: the emotional, and then the cathartic or um, educational effect of the poem. The two elements of teaching and delighting.
Mm,
In other words, the poem, there's an intended effect, and then there may be other effects, that accompany it. But there is a poetic intention and impact there. Modernism, effect becomes the point of the poem, number one, and number two, the meaning lies in the individual effect each reader has upon reading it. In other words, if one reader gets one thing from it and another feels something totally different, they're both right, because the meaning of the work lies in the different perception. There's no core truth that from different angles. It's merely
mm,
an object for interpretation by whatever pair of eyes come across it. Much like Cubist art was in the visual world. In fact, Cubist art had a huge impact upon the early modernist poets. Wyndham Lewis and I think Ezra Pound too were also double, and certainly E. Cummings also doubled as Cubist or Cubist inspired artists,
mm-hmm.
painters. So the two are inseparable when we're talking about the artistic perspectives in modernism. Um, so and that has only gotten worse. There's no meaning, there's no intent other than to have some effect on the reader in viewing the poem as an object of perception rather than a tool of conveying some truth or meaning behind it.
Right. And I mean, okay, it's very existential, but okay, let's say somebody says, well, okay, so what? Who cares? We're different people have different perceptions. That's life. That's actually how things are. Different people feel different about different things. That's the whole point. That's what it's doing. That's a fair question, right? But maybe just to frame, let's give that question some context. Okay, so things are relative, right? Experience is relative. Yes, experience is relative. Is there something that's not relative? Is there something that we can all tap into? Are there things that are relative against the backdrop of things that are constant, or is everything just relative? And I think the tendency of people, especially today, right, is um, this increasing tendency towards the idea that sure, everything is relative. And so the poetry is a lot of modernist poetry, not all, of course, there's all sorts of different ideas, but there's this idea of the subjective effect on the individual, right? As you said, with people like Eliot, he sort of codified this idea with his idea of uh,
Objective correlative.
the objective correlative. I was going to say categorical, like imperative for some reason. Objective correlative, and the whole idea is a specific set of images or ideas will lead to a specific subjective feeling, right? They'll create the conditions for people to feel whatever they feel, which they can't feel with any other combination or assortment of things or images. But I hear you wanting to chime in, and I would just say, let's take a step back though. A lot of people have there's a whole lot of alternative realities today, right? There's this whole idea of virtual reality, right? Especially with AI, of fantasy, right? And the drug culture has really played a big part in this, right? If we think of things like Huxley's Brave New World, right? That really Huxley, in one of his talks at Berkeley in California, he spoke of the idea of getting people to love their servitude and getting people to put the chains on themselves. And the question is, if you're an oligarch, and I think he is speaking from an oligarchical perspective, right? That okay, so is it easier if we really want to get people to, if we really want to control people, are we going to do that most effectively by imposing a reality on people, by imposing a moral code or a fixed system of belief? Or are we going to be more successful if we can manage to get people to create their own realities, right? To create their own alternative worlds. And we see this with video games, right? Especially with young people, the impact that this has on children, developing minds, where whatever's going on, you can just tune out. You play your video games, and for 10 hours, 20 hours straight, however many hours they play video games, and that's your reality, right? So there's this whole culture of escapism and subjective reality. So something is seemingly something that doesn't really seem harmful, like this idea that everybody has their own reality or their own truth, as you mentioned in a previous discussion. um, this can take all sorts of forms. There's a great painting by Goya, El sueño de la razón creates monsters. The sleep of reason creates monsters. It's a great sketch. And I think it speaks to this idea. Okay, everybody gets to create their own reality. Go. So some people are going to do it through drugs. Some people are going to do it through art. Some people are going to do it however. But we can become enslaved to our own realities, right? What saves us from our own, quote unquote realities is the idea that there is a higher truth that we can actually branch out and reach out to. What happens if that's no longer there?
Well, that's why we have poetry. And you kind of gave me a lot to digest there with that question.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I guess I would answer. Let's just go back to your initial.
You're allowed to answer with a poem too if you want.
I'll get to that, but I think the initial objection that you raised to my criticism of modernism, it deserves a reply. So what? People do glimpse things differently. So what? They do have different perspectives. Okay, but if you just have different perspectives and no one is more right than another, what's the point of talking about it? You have to presume that there's a central truth to be arrived at, that otherwise there's no problem to be solved, in which case it's not worth talking about. Everything just becomes either speculation or navel gazing. Well, I think this. Well, I think this. Well, if neither of us is right, well, I have no reason to explore what I'm thinking. And that's not only where poetry dies, that's where philosophy dies, that's where thinking dies.
Mm.
Um, and I think a lot of that has to tying that in with virtual reality and the drug culture. I think a lot of that has to do, or that its prevalence has to do with an acceptance, a cultural acceptance of the idea that there is no underlying truth or reality, so why bother? And we have the technological and monetary, at this point, monetary means to create our own reality, so we might as well just uh, close ourselves off into our own little bubble and make virtual reality into our reality. What we're seeing really is a perverse end result of putting the ideas behind modernism into practice. So in reality, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and the early modernists are not all that far removed from virtual reality and internet forums and uh, tripping on acid and whatever else you have.
Yeah, I mean, again, this isn't to dump on modernists or modernism, and there's a lot of interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting insights that we can gain from studying the modernist era. But I think it helps to situate these kind of issues within a broader perspective of the world.
And it's important to separate craft from purpose. No one's going to argue that T.S. Eliot is poorly written poetry, or that as opaque as it is, or that Ezra Pound, as weird or convoluted as his cantos seem, aren't meticulously and well crafted. We're not saying that they're crappy poets and we know better than them. What we're saying here is they spring out of a mindset that needs to be questioned and re-examined, because where has it brought us? Are we in a good place today as a society and a culture? I sure as heck don't think so. So how do we change that? We have to look at where we came from, how we got here, and analyzing the ideas behind the poetry is a key component of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it really comes back to this whole subjective question, right? That if it's all just subjective, and if we're all just supposed to get our own subjective experience of the poetry, well, okay, so we have our own subjective reality. Well, then think about this whole question of the brave new world. Let's think in concrete terms. We very much in many ways live in something like a brave new world. You know, people have their synthetic music, they have their soma, and they have their promiscuous sex. They have everything they need to be quote unquote comfortable, quote unquote contented, quote unquote.
And instead of the mass-produced laborers to do it, they have technology to do the hard labor for them.
Yeah, they have AI. And increasingly in the fourth industrial revolution, as they're discussing, you know, increasingly there, this is an actual discussion. Yuval Hariri, he gave a talk at the World Economic Forum, how to survive the 21st century. And one of his main themes was this whole idea that the fourth industrial revolution, the 21st century, would create a whole new class of a global useless class where AI would be able to replace most human beings and most, you know, functions that people fulfill in our current globalized economy, and that therefore, you know, their only chance is to integrate AI into their biology. This is what they're talking about, that AI has to become a part of biology. This is just the next step in evolution, people getting, you know, all sorts of digital some people are talking about digital implants.
Well, Davos is its own bubble. It's no less of a bubble than the virtual reality or the gaming internet gaming sites. The only difference is the people doing that have the money and political connections to uh, create, force their vision on other people to some extent. But that's another pie in the sky dream. It presumes an endless supply of cheap energy. And what we've seen in Texas places so far, I don't know if that's a real safe bet at this point.
Right. And well, just to get back though, the whole idea of the brave new world, right? That I think a lot of people, regardless of what you think about modernism, to be quite frank, you know, this whole idea that we are in very much in something like a brave new world with our soma, which is I'm here in Montreal, you know, marijuana is legal. You can get it at any dispensary. You can't go to the gym, but you can go buy weed and alcohol.
Oh, sure. I mean, look at I'm about an hour and a half drive from Michigan. When they shut down, you couldn't buy hardware, or certain parts in the hardware store were blocked off, but marijuana dispensaries and liquor stores were open. They were deemed essential. I mean, it's so blatant. It's not. It would make you laugh if you didn't want to cry first.
Yeah, and I think the whole question becomes, okay, so we are in this brave new world, and I don't think many people can deny it. But some people, right, who take the position that you know, really reality is subjective, or everybody, you know, there is only subjective value judgments that can be made, and everybody can subscribe to their own reality. Then okay, so if you have all these comforts, right, if you can create your own reality, why would you push back about against something like a brave new world, right? You have your sex, you have your drugs, you have your synthetic music, whatever form that takes. Why would you push back? Why would you go through all the trouble of getting, you know, getting in trouble, getting canceled, or whatever form that takes today, if
and
you can
and
be
most people
comfortable?
don't. Most people the
Well,
will for
we have Amazon Prime and Netflix. Why would we?
it.
Right? So here's where I think the question of poetry really becomes fundamental. You know, what if you're tired of Netflix? What if you're tired of Amazon Prime? Right? What if you don't like what it's doing to your soul?
Well, for a lot of people, and I don't mean to sound flippant, you go kill yourself. Look at what has happened with suicide rates.
Yeah, and it's not to say that everything on Amazon Prime or Netflix is bad. And yes, what you just said is very tragic, but it also I think it's the point though is that yeah, you have all these things, but is it really enough? And I think this question of is it really enough, well, what is that other thing which however faint and distant, however faint a glimmer this thing might be in our consciousness, well, I think this is where poetry really comes in. And
it's meaning. It's meaning, and you know, to go into more detail, when the physical gratification, the entertainment isn't enough, because it doesn't supply fundamental meaning to your existence. And when you're numb to it, when new experiences or sensual pleasures have lost their appeal, if you don't have that grounding on what your purpose and the meaning of your existence is, that leads to things like suicide. And we can talk about cultural norms and all that, but generally, mass suicide is a modern phenomenon, and I think that's not. When I say, I don't mean mass suicide like all people at once. I mean the epidemic of suicide, the increased number of suicides is a modern phenomenon, and it might be intentional by some. We talked about the Malthusian population control cult in our previous cast, but
well, you just right away.
It's definitely a side effect of the loss of meaning.
Yes,
And
yes, loss of meaning. I mean, even if people who have meaning, and I'm sorry if I'm cutting you off here, but I feel like this is such a compelling point that you're making. A lot of people are willing to suffer if there's a reason for it, if there is meaning. But you just said it. It's when there's no meaning, who would suffer? Who would tolerate meaningless suffering? Why? Why would you? Right? Unless there is some meaning, who would tolerate senseless, meaningless suffering? And I feel like that might be the theme of a lot of poems, that it is all just senseless, meaning suffering in our, contemporary or modern world. That may very well be the theme of a lot of poems, but it poses a paradox, right? You're just getting at it. If there's no meaning, then why would you be willing to suffer? Why would you be willing to struggle? And poetry, I think you're making the point that timeless poetry gets at precisely this idea of meaning, how we get to meaning. What does it mean to have meaning?
exactly, in a way that modernism can't, because it is so averse to having meaning. Its meaning is in the observer rather than in the ideas the poem expresses. So you're right. When we talk about timeless poetry, we mean poetry that not only has meaning in itself, but allows the individual reader to find meaning in it, and find meaning in his own existence.
Yeah. And I mean, if it's just subjective, right? If we all have our own subjective reality, then why are we all going crazy? Right? Why are people killing themselves? Why don't they just create a new reality? Right? It's probably because they've tried. It's probably because they've tried to make up their own meaning. We all have, right? But that itself, I think trying to do that in most cases results in, the very, grim realization that it doesn't work, right? But I think that's actually good, right? That's not a bad thing, because that's the paradox that compels us to search for a higher meaning, right? To search for it's not a meaning that somebody is going to, ascribe to you. That's not what we're talking about, but it's an actual investigation of the nature of what it means to be human, right? And how we can actually go about that. And poetry has historically, think of Homer's epics, right? This totally shaped the imagination and the spirit of a civilization. Think of Dante's comedy and how this completely revolutionized the image of human beings that had existed before then, or that had dominated society at that time, before the Golden Renaissance, which was really an expression of the ideas found in Dante's comedy, you had a feudal system. 95% of the population was illiterate, right? If you were a farmer, if your father was a farmer, you were a farmer. There was no changing of status or state or place in society, or realizing your own potential. You were whatever lot you were born in. And the whole idea of the Renaissance changed that, because the idea was that every individual had this divine spark. And the purpose of a nation, the purpose of a republic, as opposed to an empire or some feudal aristocratic system, was the development of this creative innate potential within each individual to create a society where each individual could realize that full potential in whatever form it would take. And so that didn't really work with an oligarchical outlook on society. And the reality, the result was a revolutionary transformation of society, huge bounds of progress, population growth, development, technology, science, art. It was everything. It wasn't just Michelangelo painting on ceilings, right? It was really a whole new outlook on humanity that actually spread to more of the general population. And you could find this if you read the comedy and you really consider the leaps that Dante has to make as he goes from hell to purgatory to heaven, the qualitative shifts in thinking that are necessary. They're not just different places, they're different states of mind. And the whole art of the comedy is how one transitions from one state of mind into another. And in a sense that we have to go through hell before we get to paradise, among other themes, right? We have to confront certain paradoxes, certain limitations about our own sense of identity, about our own nature, about our own weaknesses and struggles, before we can actually make that transformational leap and fully embrace that higher nature and really let go of our previous assumptions. I think that that's really the biggest challenge in Dante's comedy, is Dante having to let go of his previous ideas and take a leap of faith into something completely different, or something that feels completely alien to the inferno that he was in. And it's scary.
Well, I had mentioned before, the what we call the Renaissance was actually the successful one. There had been 4 or 5 previous Renaissances that didn't quite make, and when I say Renaissance, I mean attempts at restoring classical culture. You had the Hohenstaufen Renaissance, and those all fell flat for various political and cultural reasons.
Yeah,
But it would be an interesting
you cut out there
thesis.
for a second. I apologize. You cut out there for a second, but you said
I'm sorry.
You said the Carolingian Renaissance. That's probably
The Athonian, the Hohenstaufen under Frederick II. These had all petered out for various political and cultural reasons, but you could make the argument that what we call the Renaissance was successful because you had Dante and Petrarch and the poets introducing it or leading the charge when it came. You didn't have that with any of the previous attempts. In fact, you mentioned Homer. That's the beginning of classical Greece. Homer was the first. And then the Aeschylus and the tragedians and all of that came in the wake of Homer. Virgil, with Latin, he took the Homeric epic and gave the Latin language its own version. And that was, the beginning of the Augustan age of literature. And you could say the same thing about, Chaucer in English. There really wasn't much in the way of English by Boccaccio in the Italian Renaissance, and introduced these ideas through poetry into English literature. When Chaucer, of course, criticized the society that he saw, much like Dante. So, you could make the case you have good poetry, you have a betterment of society.
Yeah, and I think that's what we need to see now. I think we could really use that. And I think poetry, I mean, it's not all up to poetry, right? It's not all up to art. There are all sorts of things that have to happen in the world. But where are people going to really, what source do people have to draw inspiration from? I think poetry really is one of these sources. And I mean, who knows what form it'll take as well with 21st century cinematic technology and all sorts of different things. It doesn't just mean it'll be in written form. I think if Shakespeare were alive today, I don't even really think he'd be writing plays. I think he'd be writing screenplays. I think he'd be writing for um, you know, Hollywood, or probably not Hollywood, would trying to destroy Hollywood, and
I was
produce.
going to say he would probably be canceled for writing the character of Othello.
Right. He would even if he hadn't written any of these plays, he would probably can't be canceled today for whatever it is that he would write, because he challenges people and their axioms, right? And I mean, throughout history, why was Socrates put to death? He was canceled. He was canceled because he was upsetting the powers that be. He was actually getting people to think, and that can be very dangerous,
And
right?
he was condemned to death by a jury, and in Athens the juries were 500 people.
Mm.
So this, it was an action of the crowd.
Yeah, which is also, I think poetry is there, that calm voice in the burning theater. You have all these different voices, but it just takes one to sort of rip away the veil, right? Or really just speak to a higher reality or a higher truth, or what everybody's thinking but not saying.
It's like the story of the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah, which is great. They're great ironies. That's why they're still around, right? It's a great and timeless irony, and it's very powerful because it gets people to sort of free themselves from having to abide by any kind of prescriptive knowledge or societal norms. I'm going to appropriate that term for making this point when it's usually used to make opposite arguments. But poetry really is freeing. It's really powerful, and I think we need to see more of it. We need to get it more. It needs to be really center stage in terms of shaping the kinds of discussions and defining the great paradoxes that face the human species in the 21st century. I think poetry is really where you're going to find that, and then it spills over into other avenues. And so, yeah, I mean, there's do we want there's many things we want to talk about, but maybe a poem would be appropriate now, because we are coming upon Robert Frost's birthday.
Sure.
Robert
I
Frost,
will pick out. It's a shorter one, uh, and one of my favorites. Um, let's see when. I think this is from towards the middle of his poetic career. It's a fairly well-known one. Um, Nothing gold can stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay.
Mm.
It's only 7 lines, but it encapsulates a powerful idea in so few words and in such simple language. And it does it through, well, metaphor. The metaphor again is the Greek word for transfer. It's the transfer from an idea to an object and vice versa. And here we have the early shoots of spring and their gold color, uh, which is fleeting. It buds and germinates into the green leaf. And what the poem does is it captures the fleetingness of that moment, yet at the same time the moment is so cherished because it's fleeting. um, Almost an inability. Its elusiveness is what makes it so dear. And implied conversely, if it were permanent, it wouldn't have that same emotional pull, that same or draw, that same uh, value to the narrative voice that it does.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of a lot of things, because, is really Eden the thing that we want to strive for? Nothing gold can stay. Well, is gold really the thing that we want to chase after? What's considered gold today? Will it be considered gold tomorrow? I don't. That's maybe another way of looking at it as well. I mean, that's what I think of when I hear that. Yeah.
Well, and you can also read a Platonic reference in it. You have uh, the gold person. Gold as a metaphor for the highest quality, the the purest. What's the word I'm looking for? The purest soul, so to speak.
Mm.
Um, that's that. It could be, because we live in an imperfect and fallen world. It's always fleeting, but we can still appreciate it and cherish it while we are experiencing it, and hold on to the idea of it when it's gone.
Right, and I mean, there's a great irony there, right? He's nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Right, this realization that we can't really hold on to it, right, changes our ability to appreciate it as well. But that there are all these other hues as well, right? Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, which that forces us to consider that there are other hues. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. There's it comes full circle there, and it forces us to consider our own mortality, right? And but why are we going to consider? I feel like some more existential interpretations of this will, yeah, everything changes, everything dies, right? Everything nice disappears. Is that really it? Yes, nice things disappear, but the question is there more to life than just quote unquote nice things as
Well,
well?
why
How
write about it? I mean, Frost isn't just whining here. I mean, if you want whining, go listen to goth poetry or something. But yeah, it's finding meaning in the loss itself,
Mm,
and the meaning comes from, the poet, the voice, being able to hold on to that golden state of nature even after it's gone. The it lives on within, so to speak.
mm.
You could say that that's a metaphor for poetry. Poetry preserves that fleeting golden moment that's gone, but that still stays with the poet, with the observer, and with anyone who reads the poem and experiences it. It's capturing a sense perception, a moment in eternity, and universalizing it.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think it it's it forces us to consider the whole question of meaning, that there are, I mean, these things that are fleeting, but I can't help but feel like at the same time, recognizing that these things do flee. I think of Keats as well in his Ode to a Nightingale. He hears the nightingale song, he has this vision, right? He imagines all these things and then it's gone. And he says, what is it? Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? There's a transcendental quality there, that in recognizing that um, mutable aspect of the world, the acceptance of that forces us to consider um, what remains as well. And I don't think Frost is necessarily saying that, getting at that directly, but this nothing gold can stay forces us to consider what else there is. Are we really just going to chase after gold? It's there. It's a part. It's a whole. It's a part of the experience. But I think there's a wisdom in recognizing that nothing gold can stay, and it's not just a question of losing the things that we care for. But as you said, there's an irony there, that really, um, you know, creates a paradox in one's mind about, well, if the fact that we recognize what things do matter, in because their absence makes forces us to consider that, and I think that changes one's perspective. But again, that implies that there is meaning and there are things that matter. And what kind of culture do we want, where we actually recognize those things that are most important. We accept our mortality, right? I think you have to be able to accept your mortality if you're going to read something like Nothing Gold Can Stay. And that means that you're not just living for all the immediate experiences that you can get in life, until you reach the end point, but you actually consider which one of those experiences have the most value, right? You're forced to consider which things have value, so that uh, you don't get you don't stray too far off course, right? I mean, Dante says, in the midst of our life's way, I found myself within a darkened forest, for I had lost the path that does not stray.
Well, yeah, if you're lost in entertainment and sensory pleasure, you don't notice when the gold is gone. You,
Mm,
you don't you don't you don't have the same reflection that this poem, that gives birth to a poem like this in the first place, or that can understand what it's saying.
mm. Yeah, and I think this makes me think of the whole question of tragedy. You know, what is the nature of tragedy, which is one of the most powerful forms of poetic expression. You know, as seen with Shakespeare's tragedies, with Aeschylus. You know, you don't in Brave New World, and I mean he explicitly says it, right? Aldous Huxley in the Brave New World, the savage is explicitly told there's no room for tragedy in the Brave New World, right? Because people are supposed to be happy, and tragedy would upset all that. You know, consequences to one's actions, you know, facing good, facing bad, facing grief, facing joy. That complicates everything. And that can't be allowed if you just want people to, you know, be these mindless drones just seeking, or these beasts, right? These conditioned beasts that just seek momentary, uh, you know, release, pleasure, satisfaction, and are just always going back for their next fix. Tragedy overthrows all that, right? Somebody in the Brave New World can't see that they're in a tragedy, right? There is no tragedy for them. And you even said that at the end. You mentioned that last time when we discussed Brave New World, how when the guy actually commits suicide, you know, it's like it's very cynical. It's not actually a tragedy. There's a whole film crew or whatever, photographers. You know, it's like a scene. It's like a movie, right? It's surreal, and but there's no real sense of tragedy. And I think that's really the ultimate tragedy, is when people don't realize they're in a tragedy. And the whole point of great tragedy is to make you realize that you're in a tragedy. And if you lose that, you're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you could say tragedy is what what happens when perception and reality collide, or when the reality someone has constructed collapses around them and they're faced with the facts.
Mm,
That reminds me of another favorite poem of mine, Kipling's The Gods of the Copybook Headings,
mm.
which is a little long, so I won't read it here, but, you know, it deals with, you know, constructed realities and their unsustainability and what happens when they at last collapse and the eternal truths resurface again. Um,
Yeah, the Erinyes come for you, right?
yes, exactly. Well, I'll just recite the last stanza. And when all this is accomplished and the brave new world begins, when all men are paid for existing and no man must pay for his sins, as surely as water will wet us, as surely as fire will burn, the gods of the copybook headings with terror and slaughter return. Reference to the brave new world in that. And
Mm.
that was pre-Huxley.
When did he write that?
It was right after World War One, like 1918, 1919.
Interesting. Yes, he, as we discussed, he lost his son in war.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
yes, and you know, we and a lot of us think of Kipling for his jingoistic pro-imperialist poems uh, of his earlier days, but after the tragedy of the war and his personal experience with it, his poetry really uh, he again tragedy, his reality caught up with his perceptions, and his poetry takes another turn, and it produced wonderful things like the gods of the copybook headings.
Absolutely. Isn't that a poetic irony? It's unfortunate, but I think it speaks to the power of poetry and the recognition of this kind of reality. Tragedy is the setting in of reality. And if you deny reality, then there is no real tragedy. And if there is no real tragedy, um, all sorts of crazy things start to happen. All sorts of crazy things can happen, right? If there's no sense of consequence, there's no sense of, lawfulness to
Well,
what.
I mean, you were talking about Aeschylus. I mean, look at the Orestia. You have Clytemnestra murders her husband to marry her lover and make him king. There are consequences to that.
Hmm,
Orestes murders his mother to avenge his father. Yes, he delivered the consequences, but guess what? Consequences to that too.
right.
And then at the end, he has to, purify himself to purge him of that sin. That's the eternal law. It's a giant story of reality coming home to bite. There are consequences to what you do.
Right. And there is also what's amazing about this tragedy, right, is that there is a final transformation. There's really a surprise at the end, right? Because, as you said, these things coming home to roost. The Erinyes, though, right, they have to break the cycle has to be broken. And so the Erinyes become the Eumenides, if I'm not wrong, and they become the preservers, the keepers of justice. I believe they're appointed by Athena. And so the whole idea is that, that we have to break this vicious cycle. And so on top of this tragedy, there's the idea of, forgiveness, or, changing one's axioms and one's way of looking at the world, such that the Erinyes can become the Eumenides.
Yes, yes, but it's something that has to be done to achieve that transformation.
Mm-hmm.
There's uh, you still have to pay your debt.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And God, there's a lot of poetry there. That's that's very powerful.
Well, it is. It's a powerful story that thousands of years. I mean, operas have been written about it. How many paintings have been made of it? How many variations of that story have appeared in literature? It's it inspired Schliemann to go to Greece and dig up the actual cities. I mean, these are
Right.
powerful things.
Right. Absolutely. Said otherwise, I mean, there is a consequence to just playing video games for 20 years straight as well. There's consequences to that as well. Or just living in a Netflix, Amazon Prime fantasy all the time.
Binge watching.
Yeah, binge watching. I mean, we're all guilty of that at some point. I know I am. But I also see the problems with it, and I also strive. This is why I founded the Chained Muse, right? This is why we do the things we do, because we do see the need for timeless poetry, and we do see the need for meaning, right? And this striving for universal truth, universal beauty. That without that, you don't have your lighthouse anymore. You just have ships in the dark sea going in all which ways, and we see what that looks like in the real world, right? We're seeing what that looks like right now.
Well, very apt analogy, because what does a lighthouse do? It warns you where the rocks are. Um, and that's what, like Aeschylus, for example, we have these bloody deeds. It's saying, hey, this isn't good. See how these people had to pay for it. And that's what look at Hamlet. Same thing. The king murders his brother, his predecessor, marries the widow, and then the orphan son ends up, murdering him, and in marches the enemy at the end after everyone has killed themselves. I mean, that's what tragedy does. It by example, it teaches. And at the same time, we could say it delights. What kind of perverse watching all these deaths simulated on stage? Well, no, the delight comes in knowing that what you're seeing is tragedy, and in drawing the lesson from it.
Yeah, my God, as I'm hearing this, I'm saying, wow, thank God for poets. Thank God for tragedians, so that we don't have to go through all of the tragedy, right? To really learn from these mistakes, to learn from these myths and these stories, to actually, uh, you know, understand the wisdom that these poets are trying to offer us.
Yeah, otherwise you live in an eternal present, invent the wheel all the time. That's why literature exists, is to record these experiences and ideas, so that the future generations can build from them, instead of having to relearn them the hard way every time.
Absolutely, it's it's such a powerful thing. There's and we need new tragedies, that not real ones. But as I hear all this talk, I'm saying, well,
Have you read the news? It's like one
I would,
giant
I would
tragedy.
like to read a new great tragedy, written by some like 25-year-old or something, right? Some rising poet. It's also, I mean, it's kind of, it also makes me think, isn't it interesting that I'm not really familiar with many tragedies among the modernists? Um, I don't really know of many great tragedies.
Oh no, and that's a very, very good point. Modernist uh, drama is mostly in the realms of the absurd. It's Dada, waiting for Godot, things like that. Um, and tragedy is, um, to borrow from Theodore Adorno, tragedy is ersatz. It's it's fake. It's because it it it, pre- it presents. I think modernists are uncomfortable with the idea of, well, I don't think that's what I've been discussing. Modernists are uncomfortable with the idea of a reality. And if
Absolutely.
tragedy is reality coming home to bite, it's a brutal reminder that this thing called reality is out there, and that your perceptions are always going to be subject to it. And that's not an idea that meshes well with modernism. So they treat tragedy as something primitive, or ersatz, or just it's not modern. It's from the past. It had its time. It's unsophisticated. It doesn't have a sophisticated view of the world. We hear that all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is actually pretty simple. They don't like, if you have a problem with the idea of reality, tragedy doesn't really work for you, because tragedy implies for there to be a tragedy, an actual tragedy, not just something that's, subjective and personal, and it's not actually tragic, it's just tragic for you. For there to actually be something tragic, tragedy implies that something went wrong. And if something went wrong, if there's a wrong, that means there's also a right. And that implies that there's a good and there's a bad. And that's very troubling for a lot of for it was very troubling for a lot of the modernists. It may be very troubling for a lot of people listening to this. But therein lies the rub. Tragedy implies that there's something went wrong. For there to be wrong, it means there's a right. And this is what Shakespeare demonstrates time and time again. And what happens when things go against the natural um, the natural tendencies of the universe, right? Whether it's Macbeth and this total power lust. I was listening the to Macbeth as I was working. Probably not the best way to listen to Shakespeare. So, you kind of have to focus, and I kept having to, what did they just say? But the acting was pretty good, and you just saw the total power lust in these people, and like they're totally drunk, and it's disgusting. It's actually very disgusting to see the way that especially Macbeth's wife. Well, it's really Macbeth's wife, and the way he just sort of gets manipulated, and you're just like, what delusion? Who cares? How are you so obsessed with this? And you just see all the things that they're going through, having to do in order to, keep to this belief, keep to their idea. The witches told him that he's going to be king. And as soon as the wife heard that, he's going to be king, and it doesn't matter how many people they need to kill, right? How much blood they need to spill, he's going to be king. This is what they believe. This is what was said. This is what needs to happen.
Well, and going towards, the idea of reality and right, good tragedy is not, or all real tragedy really, it's not just a series of unfortunate events befalling people. It's not someone's house burning down, although that is a tragedy. It's not tragedy in the literary sense. The good tragedy we're talking about always involves a choice. We have Macbeth's decision to become a tool of his wife, even though he knows it's not the best course of action to take. We have Hamlet struggling, his famous soliloquy, what do I do? Do I just end it all right here? And his decision at the end to kill his uncle and mother.
Mm,
Or King Lear, his decision to disinherit the youngest daughter because she won't say nice things to him.
mm,
All these, it's these human decisions that set in motion the action. And you could go to the Greek tragedy too. It's human action and human emotion that sets in the course of events in motion that ultimately brings it back to hit them.
yeah, yeah, it's really powerful. It's really amazing. And I really think we need more of that. I think people should definitely revisit these tragedies and think about, we may have some aspiring writers, some aspiring poets listening. What might a great modern tragedy look like? An actual, a literary, a poetic work of tragedy, not just the stuff that you see outside every day, not that kind, but what might a great work of modern tragedy, if we can call it that, what might that look like today? And I think that's it's actually very inspiring, right? Because it's a great challenge to actually think about how one can get back to this Shakespearean level, right? This level of of Greek tragedy. That this isn't, again, I think this is the point that we started with. These things don't change. I mean, the some things are unchanging, and the kind of lessons that are drawn from great tragedy, these things persist. These things do not partake of mutability. And I think that's very powerful to think about that, and how might we capture that within uh, the bounds of our current reality in a timeless way. It's really, I mean, it's a great challenge. This is no walk in the park, but all the more, I think these are the kind of challenges that serious artists, serious poets want to think about, and
That they have to think about. And if you're not thinking about these things, can you really be called a serious poet?
absolutely.
You know, I hate to be, I don't like to be one to say, well, oh, you're not a serious poet if you don't think this way. But, you know, we're, these are the ideas that give birth to poetry. If you're just greeting cards on the one extreme, or if you're just writing about how you feel on a particular Monday morning, you know, you're not, even though you might use beautiful language to do it, you're not writing real poetry.
Hmm. Yeah, there's 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 something more, and I think that's where the shift will really come from. It's that something more. There's plenty of good writers, but that's not exactly what we're talking about. And I think it's when we really start to see that something more uh, surfacing, and even God forbid, rearing its head in the world of cinema, right? In the world of not necessarily Hollywood, but great films that actually capture this tragic principle. There's actually more opportunity to do that now than there's ever been, if you think about it, in terms of what's available, what's there, the way information is actually shared and disseminated today, and content. There's actually there's unbounded potential there. Our knowledge of the universe is so much more vast, and I don't think that's limiting at all. It actually it forces a whole new set of paradoxes. Um, so yeah, there's really room for all sorts of great tragedy, great art right now, and I think when the world is in a time of great crisis, this actually forces out these higher qualities. This idea of the sublime, Schiller called it the sublime, and it's been discussed by other people, but he discusses it especially well in his essay on the sublime. He wrote two essays. There's Of the Sublime, and there's On the which is an earlier essay, and On the Sublime. And he really makes a great point. I can probably read it for people now because it's really powerful. It's worth hearing, and maybe a lot of our listeners haven't heard this yet. So I just want to. There's two great quotes. He says, so this is he's writing his On the Sublime. Beauty, in the form of the goddess Calypso, has enchanted the valiant son of Ulysses. And through the power of her charm, she holds him for a long time imprisoned upon her island. For he long believes he is paying homage to an immortal deity, since he lies only in the arms of voluptuousness. But a sublime impression seizes him suddenly in the form of Mentor. He remembers his better destiny, throws himself into the waves, and is free. So this idea of just completely freeing oneself from the prison that we created for ourselves, that there's something within us that can recognize uh, this reality, that can see at the moment that it realizes that I'm actually being enslaved, or I'm enslaving myself. This is where the idea of the sublime comes in, right? Actually rising above the, in a sense, rising above the tragic um, tendency, and just breaking free from it in the same way that Ulysses just breaks free from this goddess, right? From the shore, from this voluptuous deity and island, and he's free.
That's an interesting contrast to around the same or a little earlier, Sir Edmund Burke's essay on into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. His idea of the sublime is that it's an experience that inspires particularly the passion of fear or fear of death specifically. For example, a storm, a large mountain. It gives a sense of fear and insignificance, which causes the observer to realize his own mortality. In contrast to vastness, infinity, etc. So it's kind of an opposite approach, but I
Yeah.
think both equally valid to the sublime.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Schiller, there's a counterpoint between the idea of just beauty, pure beauty, which is, in a sense, beauty is still sensual. It's very pleasing. There's a harmony. But then he says, but there's also the need for the sublime. There are these moments when, just having pure beauty and comfort and pleasure and enjoyable things, that's not actually always going to solve your problems. And the whole idea of the sublime is that sort of awakening and sort of throwing that all away in a moment's notice in order to respond to the crisis or the reality that presents itself before you. And so I think this idea of the sublime is a really powerful and important concept, especially in the kind of times that we're in today. It's not just about beauty per se, but this idea of the sublime is actually, this is what we see in great tragedy as well. It's what it brings out in us, right? As a result of seeing that tragedy, do we really want to be tragic figures? What's the alternative? Well, there's the sublime figure, right? There's the sublime act, which, and here Schiller describes it again in his essay. It's so powerful. He writes, "The feeling of the sublime is a mixed feeling. It is a combination of woefulness, which expresses itself in its highest degree as a shudder, and of joyfulness, which can rise up to enrapture, and although it is not properly pleasure, it is widely preferred to every pleasure by fine souls. The union of two contradictory sentiments in a single feeling proves our moral independence in an irrefutable manner. For as it is absolutely impossible that the same object stand in two opposite relations to us, so does it follow therefrom that we ourselves stand in two different relations to the object, so that consequently two opposite natures must be united in us, which are interested in the conception of the same in completely opposite ways. We therefore experience through the feeling of the sublime the state of our mind, that the state of our mind is not necessarily conform to the state of the senses, that the laws of nature are not necessarily also those of ours, and that we have in us an independent principle, which is independent of all sensuous emotions." So that's really powerful. He's speaking to something that's also within every human being, this quality to act with in a sublime manner, right? To recognize the sublime within each of us and within everyone else. That's as much as a reality as all these other more agreeable and comfortable realities.
Oh yeah, in that view, sublimity is not a trigger of emotions. It's rather exists in a detachment from emotion.
Yeah, and I mean it. I think it speaks to this higher conception of, and here I'm gonna throw some Greek at you. since you like that so much. There's three different words for love in Greek, right? You have the philios, which is the fraternal, brotherly love, friendship. Then you have eros, which is the sensual, passionate kind of love.
Origin of the word erotic.
Yes. And then there is one interestingly much less heard or discussed or expressed in much of our popular culture today, which is agape, which is divine love, right? Agape is the love for humanity, and it's actually it's beautifully represented with the idea of Prometheus in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus says that he's being punished because he loved humanity too much, and as a result, having stolen fire from the gods, he is now chained to a rock with a crow pecking his liver, which he is accepting.
And in many translations of the New Testament, which were written in Greek originally, you find agape translated as charity. To clarify that that's the sort of love they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's a love for humanity.
It's selfless.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so this is also a human emotion. This is also a human quality. It's actually probably it's the most human, because as Schiller says with the Sublime, and as you were just saying, it's not actually tied to anything sensual, and yet it can be a completely transformational force, right? This doesn't, from a logical standpoint, from a behaviorist standpoint, right, from the standpoint of a brave new world, it doesn't actually make sense, right? Why would you break away from all of that? Why would you give up all that comfort, right? Why would you leave the, voluptuous embrace of a goddess, right, in order to run into the perilous sea? Why would you do that? And I think I'd say almost intentionally, this kind of emotion is kept out of popular culture. Popular culture is dominated by eros, because agape forces people to consider something within themselves, which is, if you're ruling oligarchy, if you're a ruling oligarchy, you probably don't want people to be thinking about things like that. You don't want people to be thinking at that level of with that quality of emotion. You don't want them thinking with that quality of emotion.
You don't want them thinking, period.
Yeah. And so it's you see that there's a noticeable absence of this concept for anyone who likes these three Greek words, and you notice which ones dominate, and which ones are most absent. And I mean, there's another quote that I think is worth throwing in here, and we may or may not want to close with this, but I'll just read it, and you can feel free to react. Schiller writes, so this is also from his On the Sublime. He writes, freedom and just think about this as we're considering our own brave new world and where we are. Schiller writes, freedom, with all of its moral contradictions and physical evils, is for noble souls an infinitely more interesting spectacle than prosperity and order without freedom, where the sheep patiently follow the shepherd and the self-commanding will is degraded to the subservient part of a clockwork. The latter makes man merely into a spirited product and a more fortunate citizen of nature. Freedom makes him into the citizen and co-ruler of a higher system, where it is infinitely more honorable to occupy the nethermost place than to command the ranks in the physical order. So again, I mean, Do you really prefer to just be a contented, brave new worlder? Or is there actually something sublime and more powerful, more beautiful, something that actually has meaning in saying no, that you're not just going to be another contented soul, you know, prisoner, imprisoning oneself and being imprisoned at the same time by a culture that's designed to keep you in a state of
and keeps you there in part by lying to you, telling you that, you know, your enslavement to sensuality and vice and uh, imaginary or constructed realities is somehow freedom.
Mhm. Yeah, and in part by getting you to believe that you're really making your own choice, right? That's the ultimate deception, that people are really choosing this, that they're choosing the choices that they're actually making. It's really their own free choice. Um, is it really?
Yeah.
And so I think there's really a lot of great material for these kinds of questions, and I really hope that everybody on this World Poetry Day will read some Shakespeare and think about writing great poetry, think about reading great poetry, think about reciting great poetry with your friends, you know even if that's not what you do,
Well,
just
there's that old saying, you are what you eat. I would say even truer is you are what you read. Um,
mhm.
you only pick up on these, and regardless of what stage you are, if you're a child, if you're a student, even if you're older or old, it's never too late to um, expose yourself or get exposure to these ideas, to explore them. uh, these classic poetry, older works, they're good. We know they're good because they've withstood the test of time. People beyond their immediate age, meaningful and insightful and helpful in some way. So if you read that, you will be in the mindset to create. If you read great poetry, you will be in the mindset to create great poetry.
Absolutely. And it's not just the benefit for oneself, right? The whole point, it's actually, why are we considering all these things? It's for the benefit of the other as well. It's for the benefit of the next generations.
Well, and for the people immediately surrounding you, it's that whole quip from Plato: "The unexamined life is not worth living." Um, if you're able to, literature is like a mirror, and poetry is like a mirror where you can examine your own actions in light of these ideas, and it gives you a standard by which to judge your own actions. And if you're able to govern or correct, improve your behavior, the world around, your family, your friends, your workplace, they benefit. And if the more people that do that, the world becomes a better place. I know it sounds, we hear all the time these hope, platitudes. Oh, I want to make the world a better place, or change, become an agent of change. But the only way to really change the world for the better is to change yourself, because that's the only thing you ultimately control. And to change yourself, you need to know, you need to have a standard by which to judge and change your own actions. And that's what poetry provides.
Yeah, it's really one of the most powerful sources for that. And especially, again, in another essay, Schiller says, art must not, art today, bows to the idol of the age utility, but art is the daughter of freedom. She does not she does not bow to the pressing needs of matter, right? Art must rise beyond, he says, art must rise above reality and towards the ideal. In that even if we are in a world that is in many ways, a million worlds from this ideal, right? All the more, this is where art is actually becomes the primary source for actually giving people a sense of a more a higher direction and a higher sense of cardinality in the universe, and sense of meaning, and sense of, well, what to really strive for. So yeah, I think that's poetry is one of those most powerful things, and we've seen it throughout civilization, and I hope that we're going to see it again really soon.
Well, we're doing our part.
Yeah, so I hope everybody enjoyed our discussion. We're going to be having a lot more. Feel free to reach out to us. This is the new Lyre World Poetry Day podcast, and we're going to be having a lot of new fun discussions in the coming weeks. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you Adam for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure.